Let me create a new story based on your request. When my grandmother passed away last winter, my parents seemed to forget they had disowned me 3 years earlier. They waltzed into the lawyer's office with practiced smiles, nodding confidently at distant relatives, as if they had never thrown me out for betraying family values. I sat quietly in the corner, still mourning the only person who had stood by me when I came out. My parents had cut all contact, changed the locks, and told me I was dead to them. Yet here they were perfectly poised to collect what they assumed would be their share of Grandma's estate. Then the lawyer said, my name followed by sole beneficiary of $2.8 million, and the room turned to stone. Their faces froze in an expression I will never forget. Before I tell you what happened next in that silent room, where you could hear a pin drop, let me know where you're watching from, and hit that subscribe button if you've ever had to stand your ground against family who only showed up when money was involved. Growing up in suburban Connecticut as the only child of Martin and Diana Wilson meant living under constant pressure to be the perfect extension of their carefully crafted image. Our white colonial house with its manicured lawn hosted frequent dinner parties where I learned early to perform the role of ideal son, polite, academically gifted, and appropriately ambitious. My father built a successful accounting practice, catering to wealthy families in our area, while my mother maintained her position as the chairwoman of multiple charity committees that seemed more focused on social networking than actual charitable work. From the outside, we appeared to be the quintessential American success story, hard-working professionals who had created a stable, prosperous life. Behind our glossy front door, however, lived a family built around rigid expectations and conditional approval. Every accomplishment was acknowledged with, "That is good, Damon, but next time aim higher." Every decision was scrutinized for how it might affect the family reputation or future prospects. Throughout my childhood and teen years, I excelled academically, earning top grades, captaining the debate team, and securing admission to my father's alma mater with a partial scholarship. My achievements were celebrated primarily as reflections of my parents' excellent guidance rather than my own capabilities. "This is what happens when you follow our advice," my mother would say, when introducing me to her friends, subtly reinforcing that my value was tied to my compliance with their vision. The fragile peace in our household began to fracture during my sophomore year of college when I started questioning the career path my parents had predetermined, following my father into accounting, eventually taking over his practice. My growing interest in environmental science and sustainable development was dismissed as an impractical phase that would pass once I grew up and faced reality. The definitive break came shortly after my 19th birthday, when I finally gathered the courage to come out to my parents over Thanksgiving break. I had spent years hiding this fundamental part of myself dating girls. I had no romantic interest in to maintain the facade, all while battling increasing anxiety and depression. The weight of living inauthentically had become unbearable, and I hoped that my academic success and otherwise model son behavior would buffer the disclosure. I was wrong. My father's face hardened into a mask I had never seen before as he stood up from the dining table. "No son of mine would choose this lifestyle," he said, his voice frighteningly calm. "This is not who we raised you to be." My mother's reaction was even more devastating in its controlled anger. "Do you have any idea what this will do to our reputation in the community, to your father's business? Have you thought about anyone but yourself in making this selfish choice?" The word choice echoed through our conversation like a bitter refrain. No matter how I tried to explain that this was my identity, not a decision made to embarrass or inconvenience them, they remained unmoved. The discussion escalated until my father delivered his ultimatum. "Either you agree to counseling to fix this problem and return to the path we have set for you, or you are no longer welcome in this house." I remember looking at their faces, these people who had raised me, who had attended every school event, who had proudly framed my awards, and seeing only strangers united in their rejection of who I actually was. In that moment, I understood that their love had always been conditional on me being who they wanted, not who I was. "I cannot change who I am," I said, finally my voice surprisingly steady, despite the tears streaming down my face. "And I will not try to be someone else to make you comfortable." My mother stood up, then walking to the drawer where they kept important documents. She withdrew my birth certificate, passport, and the small savings account booklet they had maintained for me since childhood, placing them in a neat stack on the table. "Then you should leave," she said coldly. "We will give you 30 minutes to pack your essentials. Anything you leave behind will be donated. Do not call us. Do not come back. We are done." 3 hours later, I sat in a cheap motel room, paid for with the emergency credit card my grandmother had given me when I started college. My life hastily packed into 2 suitcases and a backpack. The finality of what had happened was still sinking in as I called the only person I thought might still accept me, my grandmother Eleanor, my father's mother. Grandma Eleanor had always been different from her son, where he was rigid and status-conscious. She was warm and accepting. Her modest house near the coast had been my refuge during childhood summers, filled with books, art, and conversations that expanded beyond the narrow parameters my parents set. She had traveled widely as a nurse before settling into retirement, and her worldview reflected those diverse experiences. When I called her that night sobbing and barely coherent, she listened without interruption. Then she said simply, "Damon, pack up your things. You are coming to stay with me." Who you love changes nothing about the wonderful young man you are. The next 3 years transformed my life in ways I could never have anticipated. With Grandma Eleanor's unwavering support, I transferred to a college closer to her home, changed my major to environmental science, and began building a life based on authenticity rather than appearances. I found part-time work at a local conservation organization, made genuine friends who accepted me completely, and slowly healed from the profound rejection I had experienced. My grandmother became not just family but a mentor. Her home became mine, her wisdom a guiding light as I navigated a future entirely different from what had been planned for me. She encouraged me to pursue therapy, where I unpacked the damage of conditional love and began building healthier patterns. "Family should be a safe harbor, not a prison," she would say. "Never apologize for being exactly who you were meant to be." My parents maintained their absolute silence. Birthday cards I sent returned unopened. Attempts to connect through extended family met with clear messages that they considered me dead to them. Eventually, I stopped trying, focusing instead on building a life that honored my authentic self. When Grandma Eleanor was diagnosed with aggressive pancreatic cancer, I took a leave of absence from school and work to become her primary caregiver. For 6 months, I coordinated her medical appointments, managed her medications, and spent countless hours simply sitting with her, absorbing every story, every piece of advice she wanted to share before she left this world. During one particularly lucid afternoon, as her illness advanced, she mentioned she had been updating her will. "Not much to leave," she said, with characteristic humility, "but what I have should go to someone who understands its true value." I had assumed she meant her modest home and perhaps some savings. I had no idea about the investments she had quietly made over decades or the property she owned beyond her small coastal house. She passed away peacefully one autumn morning while I read to her from her favorite poetry collection. Her hand grew still in mine, her breathing gently ceased, and the world lost one of its most compassionate souls. In my grief, practical matters like wills and estates seemed distant and unimportant. It was her attorney, Michael Donovan, who contacted me about the reading of the will, explaining that my parents and several extended family members would also be notified as a formality, though Eleanor had been specific about her wishes. When I expressed surprise that my parents would attend, given their stance on my existence, Michael's careful, professional tone softened slightly. "Money has a way of revising people's principles, Damon," he said. "I would prepare yourself for their presence." Even with this warning, nothing could have prepared me for the surreal experience of sitting in Michael's office 1 week after the funeral, watching my parents walk in, as if the past 3 years of complete rejection had never happened. They wore matching expressions of appropriate grief, nodding solemnly to distant cousins and family friends. My father had even placed his hand briefly on my shoulder as he passed my chair, a gesture so shocking I nearly flinched. They took seats directly across from Michael's desk, pointedly not looking in my direction after that initial acknowledgement. Their body language conveyed absolute confidence, the slight smiles they exchanged, suggesting they had already mentally allocated whatever they expected to receive. Michael Donovan's office embodied the quiet dignity of old New England money, dark wood paneling, leather-bound legal texts, lining the walls and windows overlooking the harbor where sailing vessels bobbed gently in the autumn breeze. The conference table around which we gathered gleamed beneath discreet lighting, its surface scattered with legal documents and small bottles of water for each attendee. At precisely 10 o'clock, Michael entered from his private office, carrying a leather portfolio embossed with my grandmother's initials. His silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses completed the image of trustworthy legal counsel, someone who had managed the affairs of established families for generations. He took his seat at the head of the table, arranging his materials with deliberate care. "Good morning," he began, his voice gentle but authoritative. "We are gathered today for the reading of Eleanor Margaret Wilson's last will and testament. Before we begin, I want to express my personal condolences to all present. Eleanor was not only a client, but a friend whose integrity and compassion I greatly admired." My parents nodded in solemn agreement, my mother dabbing at eyes that remained suspiciously dry. My father sat straight-backed and attentive, the very picture of dignified grief. Their performance was flawless, observed by distant relatives who had no knowledge of how completely they had excised me from their lives. Cousin Margaret, who had occasionally reached out to me despite my parents' wishes, caught my eye from across the table and offered a small, supportive smile. Uncle James, my father's older brother, who lived in Oregon and remained largely disconnected from family politics, studied the scene with quiet curiosity. "Eleanor revised her will approximately 2 years ago," Michael continued, "and was very specific about her wishes. She underwent comprehensive cognitive assessment at that time to establish her sound mental state, and the document has been properly executed with multiple witnesses." He looked directly at my father as he said this, an almost imperceptible emphasis on sound mental state, suggesting he anticipated potential challenges. My father's expression remained neutral, but his fingers tapped slightly against the polished wood, a nervous tell I recognized from childhood. "I will begin with specific bequests," Michael said, opening the portfolio. "To Street. Mary's Hospital Nursing Scholarship Fund, Eleanor, leaves $50,000 to support future generations of caregivers." He proceeded through several charitable donations and smaller personal items designated for various friends and distant relatives. My grandmother's beloved book collection would go to the local library. Her antique medical instruments would be donated to the nursing school museum. Cousin Margaret would receive the pearl necklace that had been in the family for generations. Throughout these initial bequests, my parents maintained their composure, occasionally exchanging glances that seemed to communicate. "These are insignificant preliminaries. The substantial assets are coming." I sat quietly, genuinely moved by how carefully my grandmother had considered each recipient, matching treasured possessions with the people who would truly appreciate their significance. This was so characteristic of her thoughtfulness, her attention to the deeper meaning of objects beyond their monetary value. After completing the specific items, Michael paused, took a sip of water, and looked up at the assembled family. "Now, regarding the remainder of the estate, consisting of Eleanor Wilson's primary residence, 3 investment properties, and various financial holdings, with a combined estimated value of $2,800,000. The room grew perfectly still. The figure was substantially larger than anyone had anticipated from my seemingly modest grandmother. My father leaned forward slightly, his hand now completely still on the table surface. My mother's fingers tightened around her designer handbag. Michael's gaze moved deliberately to where I sat today. Eleanor Wilson leaves the entirety of these assets to her grandson, Damon Alexander Wilson, with no conditions or restrictions. The silence that followed was absolute. It stretched for several heartbeats before being broken by my mother's audible gasp. My father's face transformed through a series of expressions: disbelief, confusion, dawning comprehension, and finally cold anger. "There must be some mistake," he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "My mother would never bypass her own son to leave everything to. He could not bring himself to acknowledge our relationship directly." Michael's professional demeanor remained unruffled as he removed a sealed envelope from the portfolio. "Eleanor anticipated your reaction, Martin. She asked that I read this letter in the event of any objections." He broke the seal and unfolded a single sheet of paper covered in my grandmother's distinctive handwriting. Her voice seemed to fill the room as he read her words: "To my son Martin and his wife Diana. If this letter is being read, you have demonstrated exactly the reaction I anticipated. Your willingness to appear at my funeral and the reading of my will, after completely rejecting your own child, reveals everything about your character and values. When Damon needed his parents most, you chose conditional love over acceptance appearances, over authenticity, and social standing over family loyalty. For 3 years, you have maintained that Damon is dead to you because he had the courage to live truthfully. You changed locks, returned mail, and rejected every attempt at reconciliation. Yet here you sit, expecting to benefit from my death, while denying the humanity of your own son. Money reveals character, it does not create it. Your behavior confirms that my decision to leave my estate to Damon is not only right, but necessary. He has demonstrated the compassion, integrity, and courage that represents the true wealth of our family legacy qualities. I find notably absent in your actions. Damon did not ask for this inheritance. In fact, he repeatedly expressed that my love and support were all he needed or wanted. This makes him more deserving of it than those who measure family bonds in dollars and social advantage. I hope someday you will recognize what you have thrown away, which is worth far more than any material inheritance." As Michael finished reading, my mother's carefully composed facade cracked entirely. Her face flushed with anger as she turned to face me directly for the first time. "You manipulated a vulnerable old woman," she hissed. "Turned her against her own son after we took you in and gave you everything." My father's approach was more calculated. "Mother clearly was not in her right mind when she made these changes," he said to Michael, ignoring me completely. "We will be contesting this will immediately on grounds of undue influence and diminished capacity." Michael closed the portfolio with deliberate care. "You are certainly entitled to pursue that course of action, Martin. However, I should inform you that Eleanor anticipated this response as well. She maintained extensive documentation of her mental acuity, including quarterly neurological assessments. She also kept detailed records of your complete rejection of Damon, including returned mail text messages and witness statements regarding your explicit disownment." He removed his glasses, his professional distance, giving way to a more personal tone. "She also documented your absence during her illness, when Damon was her sole caregiver and support. I would advise you to consider carefully before pursuing a challenge that would make these private family matters part of the public record." My father's face had gone completely pale. As an accountant for wealthy clients, he understood better than most how devastating such revelations could be to his carefully cultivated professional reputation. My mother's hand gripped his arm, her knuckles white with tension. Uncle James broke the uncomfortable silence. "Martin, Diana, Eleanor's letter suggests you have not been truthful about your relationship with Damon. Is it true you disowned him entirely? Before either could respond with what would undoubtedly be a carefully crafted narrative, Cousin Margaret spoke up. It is absolutely true. They threw him out when he was 19 for coming out, changed the locks, and have returned every birthday card and holiday greeting he has sent for 3 years. Meanwhile, Damon dropped everything to care for Eleanor when she got sick while they visited exactly once for 20 minutes. The room erupted into murmurs as family members processed this information. My parents' carefully constructed facade was crumbling before the gathered family, revealing the truth they had concealed beneath social niceties and selective storytelling. My father stood abruptly, pulling my mother up with him. "This is not over," he said, looking directly at me for the first time. Not by a long shot. As they turned to leave, I found my voice at last. "It was over 3 years ago," I said quietly. "When you decided I was worth less than your reputation." The door closed behind them with a decisive click, leaving behind a room full of stunned relatives and one young man suddenly faced with an inheritance he had never sought or expected. The weeks following my grandmother's will, reading unfolded like scenes from a movie I was somehow both starring in and watching from a distance. My parents, true to their word, immediately filed a legal challenge, hiring an aggressive attorney specializing in contested wills. Their initial approach centered on claims of my undue influence over my elderly, vulnerable grandmother, painting me as a manipulative opportunist who had poisoned Eleanor against her own son. Michael Donovan proved to be not just a competent attorney, but a formidable defender of my grandmother's wishes. As he had warned my parents, Eleanor had meticulously documented everything: her mental clarity, my parents' rejection, and her deliberate, carefully considered decisions regarding her estate. "Your grandmother was an extraordinarily thorough woman," Michael explained during one of our strategy meetings. "She kept a journal detailing your parents' complete absence during her illness alongside your daily care. She recorded their rejection of all attempted contact from you. She even had her doctors document that she discussed her estate plans with them to establish her clear intent and understanding. The legal battle quickly became a test of endurance rather than merit. My parents seemed to believe they could force a settlement through sheer persistence and escalating legal costs, assuming I would eventually be intimidated or financially exhausted into compromising. What they failed to understand was that money had never been my motivation, not in caring for my grandmother, not in pursuing my authentic life, and certainly not in withstanding their continued rejection. The inheritance represented Eleanor's final affirmation of my worth, a tangible reminder that genuine family transcends biological obligation to embrace unconditional acceptance. My parents' strategy shifted when their initial claims gained no traction. They began reaching out to extended family members, crafting a narrative of reconciliation supposedly thwarted by my stubbornness and greed. Several distant relatives called, urging me to be reasonable and keep family matters private by agreeing to split the inheritance fairly. These conversations revealed how thoroughly my parents had revised history, claiming they had always been supportive despite some understandable initial shock at my coming out. The most difficult call came from my mother's sister, Aunt Patricia, who had once been a favorite relative before falling in line with my parents' rejection. "Damon, you need to consider what this fight is doing to your parents," she said, her voice heavy with manufactured concern. "They have been through so much, and now to have their own mother turn against them. They disowned me when I was 19. I reminded her quietly. They said I was dead to them. Now they want access to Grandma's money, while still rejecting who I am. People say things they do not mean when they are upset," she countered. "They are your parents. Nothing is more important than family." "I agree completely," I replied. "That is why I am honoring my grandmother's wishes. She was the only family who stood by me when I needed it most." The conversation ended with her thinly veiled suggestion that my stubbornness was confirming everything my parents had said about my character. It was a pattern repeated across several such interventions, the implication that by not yielding to their demands, I was somehow proving myself unworthy of the inheritance. Meanwhile, life continued its forward momentum. With Michael's guidance, I returned to my environmental science studies, while managing the immediate responsibilities of the inheritance. The modest house I had shared with my grandmother became fully mine, a sanctuary filled with memories of acceptance and love. I established a small foundation in Eleanor's name focused on supporting LGBTQ+ youth who, like me, had faced family rejection. 6 months after the will reading, my parents' legal challenges had gained no traction. The documentation Eleanor had maintained proved insurmountable, and their attorney finally advised them that continuing would only deplete their resources without changing the outcome. They made one final attempt at manipulation, a certified letter suggesting they might be willing to forgive my choices and welcome me back into the family if I agreed to a fair distribution of the inheritance. The letter concluded with what they clearly considered their strongest argument: without us, you have no family. Is money worth sacrificing the only parents you will ever have? After 3 days of consideration, I wrote a single-page response. You are right that family is irreplaceable. Grandmother Eleanor taught me that every day she welcomed me into her home after you threw me out. She showed me that family is defined by unconditional love, not by biology or legal documents. You are not offering reconciliation. You are offering a transaction. You remain unwilling to accept me for who I am. You simply want access to assets you believe should be yours. That is not family. It is negotiation. The door remains open for genuine reconciliation based on mutual respect and acceptance. But I will not dishonor my grandmother's final wishes to purchase conditional tolerance from those who have made it clear they value my conformity above my happiness. I hope someday you will want a relationship with me that is not contingent on what material advantages I can provide you. Until then, I will continue building a life filled with authentic connections. I never received a direct response to this letter. Instead, 2 weeks later, they dropped their legal challenge entirely and listed their house for sale, apparently planning to relocate outside of the community where my father's accounting practice had operated for 20 years. The carefully constructed social image they had prioritized above their own son had become impossible to maintain as the truth emerged through the legal proceedings and community gossip. Looking back now, 2 years after inheriting my grandmother's estate, I recognize that the true wealth she left me had little to do with property or investments. The $2.8 million represented freedom and possibility. Certainly, I completed my degree without debt, expanded the environmental foundation I had established in her name, and created a scholarship program for LGBTQ+ students pursuing healthcare careers. But Eleanor's most valuable legacy was the living example of how to create authentic family beyond biological obligation. She taught me that genuine connection forms around acceptance, not expectation, around support, not judgment. Through her, I learned that family can be chosen and built among those who see and celebrate our true selves. My parents have maintained their silence. They moved to Arizona, where my father established a new accounting practice, and my mother joined new social circles, presumably crafting fresh narratives about their family history. Through mutual connections, I occasionally hear fragments of their lives, achievements, celebrated difficulties navigated, all without acknowledgement of my existence. There are still moments when grief catches me unexpectedly, birthdays, holidays, accomplishments I cannot share with the people who once represented my entire world. The child in me sometimes still yearns for the unconditional parental love I never received. Therapy has helped me understand that this longing may never completely disappear and that healing does not require forgetting. What has surprised me most in this journey is how space for new connections opens when we stop trying to force relationships that demand our diminishment. My life now includes chosen family, friends who have become brothers and sisters in all the ways that matter, mentors who offer guidance without demanding conformity, and recently, the beginning of a relationship with someone who loves me, not despite but inclusive of all aspects of my identity. I still live in my grandmother's coastal home, though I have gradually made it my own, while preserving the spaces that most strongly evoke her presence: her garden of native plants, her reading nook overlooking the water, the kitchen, where she taught me that nourishment comes in many forms. The small pottery mug she used for her morning tea sits on my desk, a daily reminder of her wisdom. The bravest thing you can do in this world is to be exactly who you are, even when it costs you. My foundation's work has connected me with young people navigating their own journeys of authenticity and rejection. In helping them find resources, support, and community, I honor both my grandmother's compassion and my own hard-won understanding of what it means to build life on your own terms. Every scholarship awarded, every safe space created, every moment of connection forged becomes part of Eleanor's continuing legacy. Sometimes visitors notice my grandmother's photograph on my mantel and comment on our similar expressions: the same crinkle around the eyes when we smile, the same tilt of the head when considering something important. "You look like her," they say, unaware of the deeper truth in their observation. We share no DNA, but I have become her legacy in the ways that matter most, carrying forward her values of authenticity, compassion, and the courage to stand firmly in one's truth. The inheritance that my parents so desperately sought has been transformed into opportunities for others who, like me, need someone to believe in their inherent worth when biological family fails them. In this way, the money that could have perpetuated cycles of conditional love instead nurtures new possibilities for authentic connection. I keep the letter my grandmother left for my parents in a small box with other important documents. Sometimes I reread her words: "Money reveals character, it does not create it." The truth of this statement has been affirmed repeatedly throughout this journey. Wealth amplifies who we already are. It makes the generous more generous, the controlling more controlling, the authentic more boldly themselves. Have you ever had to stand your ground when family placed conditions on their love, or discovered that someone's true colors emerged when money entered the picture? I would love to hear your experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear more journeys of finding authentic self-worth beyond family expectations. And if you know someone struggling with conditional acceptance from those who should love them most, share this video as a reminder that family can be created among those who celebrate rather than merely tolerate who we truly are. Thank you for listening, and remember, your worth is not determined by those who cannot see it, but affirmed by the courage to live authentically despite their blindness.